Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth installment of our speaker series, Reimagining the University, sponsored by the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University, and the Center on Modernity in Transition. I'm Shahrzad Sabet. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU and co-director of the Center on Modernity in Transition.
I'm Benjamin Schewel, and together with Shahrzad, I direct COMIT. This series brings together leading thinkers to explore the historical foundations, contemporary patterns, and possible transformations of the modern research university. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Joseph Chan, Jennifer Frey, and Cornel West to discuss Are Universities Too Liberal?
Joseph Chan is Distinguished Research Fellow at Academia Sinica in Taiwan. He taught for 3 decades in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Hong Kong and is the author of Confucian Perfectionism, a Political Philosophy for Modern Times. Jennifer Frey is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of South Carolina and co-editor of the book Self-Transcendence and Virtue, Perspectives from Philosophy, Psychology, and Theology. This summer, she will become the inaugural dean of the new Honors College at the University of Tulsa. And Cornel West is the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Professor of Philosophy and Christian Practice at Union Theological Seminary and Professor Emeritus at Princeton University. His books include Race Matters, Democracy Matters, and Black Prophetic Fire. Joseph, Jennifer, Cornel, a very warm welcome to you all.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
As our loyal audience members know, we like to begin these conversations on a more personal and biographical note. So to start, I want to ask each of you to share with us a little, both about the personal and intellectual experiences that led you to choose a career as a university academic, and also about how your experiences in the academy have since shaped your thinking about the current state of the modern research university. Jennifer, let's start with you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So I'm from the Rust Belt. I'm from a small city north of Cincinnati called Hamilton, Ohio. Nobody's ever heard of Hamilton or thinks about it, but people have heard of Middletown, Ohio, because of our newly elected Senator J.D. Vance and his book Hillbilly Elegy, which is about it looks like his coming of age story in Middletown, and that's like 5 minutes away. It's basically the same kind of place. And I am also, like JD, from a very working class, somewhat hillbilly background. Anyway, I went to Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. I thought that I wanted to be a writer and study English literature, but I found my English class just extremely politicized in ways that I totally didn't understand and couldn't navigate very well at 18. But I loved my philosophy class. And I didn't actually do that well in my first philosophy class. It was like the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life. It was the first time that I didn't get an A on something. But what I realized in my philosophy class is that I had no idea why I believed anything that I believed so strongly. And I just sort of fell in love with philosophy. When I entered the university, I was like a very committed atheist. I was kind of like a new atheist type before that was a thing. And very surprising to everyone, including myself, I ended up reading my way into the Catholic faith. So I was baptized when I was 20, which was not the plan. But that's kind of for me, liberal learning was this total transformation of everything that I thought I believed. And then just in terms of my experiences, and obviously my experience is limited, but I kind of experienced this class divide that was also an ideological divide. So I didn't realize that I was more socially conservative until I went to academia. It became very clear that I was. Because the kind of PC project and the canon wars that were like raging in the late 90s, which is when I was an undergrad, I was like on the wrong side of all of those things. And I was very much an outsider in terms of my personal experience. And so I just kind of had to figure out how to navigate that and kind of figure out how I could like be myself in an environment that seemed in many ways like pretty hostile to me and pretty uninterested in my point of view. But I ended up in an elite program in philosophy. I did my PhD at the University of Pittsburgh, and I was very successful in that program. But I became over time very disenchanted with the university's self-conception of itself. This idea that the best sort of job is the job where your teaching doesn't matter at all, and you're just producing research outputs, and you're just getting huge amounts of grant money. I mean, I did all of that. I was successful at all of that. But it's also part of that you're just an expert who produces specialized knowledge. And what I kind of came to see over time was that's actually like terrible for philosophy. like philosophers aren't experts. And insofar as we produce highly specialized knowledge, it's stuff that nobody cares about. And it's not really like meeting people's actual needs. And it wasn't meeting like my needs, like when I was a young person and I came to university and I had all of these like very real intellectual needs, like this desire to understand myself and my world, that the way the university was structured, it wasn't meeting those needs at all anymore. And so I got very attracted to this project of revitalizing liberal learning and like trying to connect back to the reasons that I wanted to become an academic in the first place. That's like kind of what I've been thinking and writing a lot about now.
Thank you. Cornel, I want to ask the same questions of you. Some of your experiences as an academic, of course, have been highly publicized. For example, your recent decision to leave Harvard after the university dismissed the recommendation that you be considered for tenure. What led you to work in the academy, and how have your personal experiences shaped your views on the state of the modern research university?
Well, again, I want to say thank you very much. It's blessed to be part of this conversation and distinguished panelists, as well as the really sponsors in many ways. No, I've been very, very blessed, given my own commitment to the life of the mind. I take the issue of vocation as a starting point. I think of Max Weber's two great essays, 1917, 1919, on science as vocation, politics as vocation, what it really means to have a commitment that cuts much deeper than profession, cuts much deeper than careerism, cuts much deeper than a job, that you find great joy in pursuing the life of the mind and the fallible quest for truth and beauty and goodness. And then as a Christian, for me, the holy. And I've just been very blessed to be in places as in high school, as an undergrad at Harvard, the teachers that I've had, the Hillary Putnams and John Rawlses and Nelson Goodmans and Stanley Cavell's. They've actually enriched my life in ways that don't have a language for. And the same was true in graduate school with Sheldon Walden and Richard Rorty and Walter Kaufman, Margaret Wilson. And my teaching, and I resonate with what Sister Jennifer is talking about. I've always understood myself first and foremost on a Socratic model. And so there's a continuity between the teaching and the writing and the speaking and the spending time with students inside and out, to be pushed outside of the classroom, to be pushed by them and to unsettle them. In the end, it's really about unsettling minds on the one hand and trying to push toward the maturation of souls. So it's not just a negative thing, it's something positive in terms of this sense of enrichment and allowing them to land where they land. And so I've always understood universities as sites for Socratic energy, sites for Emersonian energy, the aversion to conformity, and being jazz-like institutions that are fundamentally concerned about being improvisational enough to learn and listen from others, to enter in such a way that it's a moment of humility, but also tenacity, because you're really committed to a pursuit that's bigger than you. And what I've encountered, of course, in the last 20 years, is what we've all encountered, which is the calling into question of the very legitimacy, not just of the university, but of the professional managerial class. The professional managerial class has been beneficiaries of corporate globalization, and that generates a certain kind of arrogance and condescension and haughtiness. So whatever the language of the guild, it could be left wing, right wing, center. It tends to be more I wouldn't say left, but it's more progressive. I don't view progressive as the same as left, but it tends to be a progressive orthodoxy, and it becomes part of the protocol. Every unit of professionalization has its own dynamics of conformity, and so you have to be Socratic and Emersonian to cut against it. And my heroes go from Erasmus to Toni Morrison. I mean, these are folk who are in some ways in the academy, but in no way of the academy. Erasmus can go to the University of Paris and see all the scholastic orthodoxy and call it into question and tell Luther to cool off, because you're going to generate some civil wars and some ugly conflict that gets out of control. And Toni Morrison's in the academy, but not of it, but she's a Catholic, deep Catholic, and yet rooted in my own tradition of Black folk trying to make sense of the sheer absurdity of the barbarity of white supremacy and its ties to predatory capitalist tendencies, and the hypocrisies of societies that are called themselves X, and in fact they're really Y, and that's part of her project, and I'm part of that. But I've gone on too long, but I appreciate it.
No, thank you. That's very interesting. I'm sure we'll come back to many of those points later in the discussion. Joseph, you've also interacted with the Modern Research University in interesting ways, moving between Hong Kong, England, the United States, most recently Taiwan. How would you answer these questions?
I was born in Hong Kong and grew up in Hong Kong, which was then a British colony and later returned to China in 1997. But Hong Kong was a unique place where Western and Chinese culture intertwined in fascinating ways. As an undergrad student at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, I was exposed to a curriculum and a campus that reflected the integration of Western and Chinese cultural cultures. Now, during my senior year in college, my fascination with political theory and philosophy began to grow. This prompted me to further pursue my academic career by obtaining a master's degree at the LSE and a DPhil in Oxford. After completing my studies, I returned to Hong Kong and began teaching at the University of Hong Kong, not expecting to stay for 30 years. I also held a research fellowship at Harvard in 1999 and a visiting professorship at Princeton from 2019 to 2022. And currently, as you suggested, I'm a research fellow at Academia Sinica in Taiwan. Well, the University of Hong Kong that I've worked with for 30 years implements a contemporary Western education model, but in a primarily Chinese community. Although the university's academic structure and management style have been influenced by British models for years, there has been an increasing influence from American universities in recent years. And nevertheless, the Hong Kong U that I know of has a unique identity shaped by this cultural and historical background. It seldom encounters the kind of cultural clashes and ideological debates that are often seen in the United States. Well, throughout my experiences in different countries, I have had the opportunity to observe and participate in diverse academic cultures and management styles. But regardless of these variations, I think there is one commonality across all universities, which is the presence of large bureaucratic structures. While faculty members may have some authority in managing academic affairs, ultimate decision-making power is typically vested in the university's top governing body, generally known as the University Council. At the University of Hong Kong, for example, the council is responsible for tasks such as selecting presidents and senior management teams, formulating overall strategies for the university, and overseeing financial matters, ensuring compliance with legal requirements, so on and so forth. In cases of controversy involving students or faculty members, the University Council possesses the authority to intervene and make the final decision regarding the necessary course of action to take. Well, based on my previous role as an elected council member of the University of Hong Kong, I have had a first-hand experience of how the University Council operates. Though it can act as a means of protecting academic freedom and preventing unjustified interference from both internal and external sources, the University Council also has the potential to become a political instrument of the government to suppress voices of dissent from both students and faculty members. So I would say, although university councils are indispensable in modern universities, they can also become a double-edged sword. It is imperative for everybody to maintain independence of the university council and vigilantly guard against any attempts to use them for political or ideological purposes. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Joseph. So the term liberalism, of course, represents different things to different people. As I've heard Cornel say on more than one occasion, anytime you talk about liberalism, you've got to historicize, contextualize, and pluralize it. So I wanted to give each of you a chance to do that at the outset of our conversation. How would you define the term liberalism? And to what extent do you think of yourself as a liberal? Joseph, we can start with you.
Liberalism is an ever-evolving tradition. It is multifaceted. It encompasses a variety of strands with different emphases and principles. So I think it's impossible to provide an uncontroversial definition of liberalism because it is shaped by one's interpretation of the tradition and one's normative concerns. Now, from my perspective, liberalism is a philosophical perspective that places a significant value on individual freedom and personal autonomy. But nevertheless, I'm particularly intrigued by the question of the boundaries and constraints of personal autonomy, especially its weights and its limits. I would say this, a strong liberal might prioritize personal autonomy above many other values, including the good life, social morals, and individual well-being. I myself do not identify as a strong liberal. Instead, I consider myself as a moderate liberal or a moderate conservative. In any case, I'm a moderate. And while I believe that personal autonomy is a crucial modern value, I also think that it must be balanced against other competing values. So for many years, I've been fascinated by the debate between a robust form of liberalism that rejects legal moralism, paternalism, and perfectionism. But I don't think that such a rejection is reasonable because I think the trade-offs between personal autonomy on the one hand and well-being and moral norms on the other hand could only be decided on a case-by-case basis. Well, I'm also interested, of course, in another debate, which is an ongoing one between economic right-wing liberalism and left-wing liberalism. Right-wing liberals emphasize small government and free markets, while left-wing liberals stress social justice, social and economic equality, and the redistributive role of the state. For myself, I'm sympathetic to the left-wing idea of a redistributive state, but I'm critical of some recent trends of liberal egalitarianism that I think overly prioritize equality as the sole normative basis for justifying policies and politics. Well, my experience in the US academia and exposure to Anglo-American political philosophy has led me to observe that liberal egalitarianism, which combines cultural liberalism with social and economic egalitarianism, is the dominant ideology on campus today. However, there are also, of course, radical left groups that focus on power inequalities and advocate for more radical changes to social and economic power structures. These groups often employ more aggressive and direct action tactics, which can draw significant public attention, but may also polarize political discourse. I have no strong view on this, but I'm a keen observant of the development of the politics of these sort of radical groups.
Thanks so much, Joseph. Jennifer, we can turn to you now.
Sure. Well, it sounds like Joseph and I are pretty close. So I guess I'll just try to clarify where I'm coming from. I was like really nervous about this question because I don't really know how to define liberalism either. And I'm not really sure. I mean, I guess I would say that I'm not really a liberal in theory, but I'm definitely a liberal in practice. And I can say more about why that is. But I'm coming out of the Aristotelian tradition, not a tradition that's primarily associated with liberalism. You know, Aristotle has a notion of us as self-determined and free, but he doesn't have this kind of very robust account of individual autonomy that I think lies at the beating heart of any liberal theory. I mean, Aristotle doesn't think that we're first and foremost autonomous individuals who just make choices for ourselves. He recognizes that we don't even really become human in the requisite sense outside of community, right? So we're first and foremost parts or participants in this greater whole, right? And that what it means to be happy or to really flourish as a human being is to contribute to that greater whole, that common good. And so really, like, Aristotle sees us as dependent rational animals. That's a term that I'm taking from Alistair McIntyre. And of course, Alistair has just been this huge influence for me, and nobody really holds up Alistair as the quintessential liberal. However, like, I'm definitely a liberal in practice. I mean, it's very easy to critique liberalism, just as like it's very easy to critique capitalism, because there are just all these obvious, really big problems with it. But on the other hand, the proposed alternatives like seem worse to me. So I'm not really attracted to them either. I guess I would say that I favor like a liberalism with really strict guardrails, a kind of reformed liberalism. So I don't just think, oh yeah, it's just unrestricted autonomy with like a harm principle thrown in or something. I think that sort of liberalism has a tendency to become mere license and to encourage a kind of rampant individualism that's like morally and politically bankrupt and dangerous. So I don't like that. I would prefer a kind of liberalism that has a more robust conception of the common good. So I'm not really a Rawlsian either, and because I don't think that it's all constructed out of formal principles. I believe in human nature. Human nature, is normative, and that's why we do see actually a lot of commonalities when we look across traditions about what that common good might look like. So I don't know how much more I need to. I'm a half-hearted liberal.
Thank you. It's very, very interesting. So Cornel, how do you understand liberalism, and to what extent would you consider yourself a liberal?
Well, you rightly noted, I look at it both through historical lens. So it's the varieties of liberalisms on the one hand, And you see, as a Christian, I'm fundamentally concerned, but not so much isms. I'm concerned about the concrete plight and predicament of the least of these, the poor and working people. So I view liberalism from Locke to Rawls as one of the great gifts produced during the age of Europe, with the emergence of modernity, the emergence of markets, commodification, the emergence of nation states, the emergence of bureaucracies, the emergence of autonomous or relatively autonomous civil societies. And one of the great gifts of precious rights and liberties. And not just that, but kind of counter-majoritarian institution that will protect those rights and liberties against the democratic majority. So that any serious talk about the good society, there has to be a liberal dimension. It is a precondition. It is a necessary condition for the possibility of the good life, especially in modern heterogeneous populations. Rights and liberties are non-negotiable. And in that sense, there's always a liberal dimension. But I know liberalism, patriarchal liberalism, Heron folk, white supremacist liberalism, imperial liberalism, that are captive to imperial ends of empires and so forth. There's homophobic forms in which the gays and lesbians are not viewed as worthy of having personal autonomy and so forth. So that's where the real debate takes place. Corporate liberalism that is captive to corporate power in the economy. So the question becomes, how do we preserve the best of the Locke Rawls tradition, but also historically recognize that if we're looking at it through the lens of especially the least of these, the most vulnerable, which is the poor and working class across race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, and nation, that we have to be very, very careful as we proceed. Now, I'm always very interested in forms of perfectionism. It could be Emersonian, it could be Confucian, it could be Neo-Aristotelian, it could be Amscomsian. Well, I don't know what the word for the great work of Elizabeth Anscombe is, but these are crucial voices in wrestling with what is the good society in relation to not just liberalism, but a whole host of conceptions of ensuring the flowering and flourishing of human beings who have a certain sanctity and have a certain dignity. And for me, in the eyes of God, but it could be egalitarian claims tied to, equality of in a content mode, or the different ways of trying to keep track of the dignity of each and every one of us.
Thank you. Thank you all. The argument that universities are too liberal takes a number of different forms in our contemporary discourse. One prominent strand of this debate claims that leftist ideas and ideologies exert a hegemonic influence in the Western academy today. These critics might claim, for instance, that it's far easier and more acceptable to be a radical Marxist in today's university than it is to be, say, a moderate Catholic conservative. Another strand of the debate claims that, in fact, liberal or progressive left ideas and ideologies have become so dominant in academic spaces that universities have begun to display illiberal tendencies, silencing voices that are deemed insufficiently progressive or insufficiently woke. A third line of critique claims, in another vein, that because of the heightened global influence of Western universities, of Western journals and funding organizations, non-Western universities have become sites for the assertion of Western liberal ideas and political agendas. This is closely related to the broader criticism from the left that the university has become a vehicle for the advancement of a neoliberal agenda. And there are other interpretations, of course, as well. But as far as these, let's say, especially prominent strands of our contemporary discourse go, would you agree with the statement that universities are too liberal? Or would you say that they're not liberal enough? Or alternatively, you might prefer to reject or to somehow reframe the very terms of the conversation. Jennifer, how do you approach these contemporary debates?
Yeah, let me just to one second. I just want to follow up on what Cornel just said. I just want to make it clear that I also believe strongly in individual rights, individual liberties, most especially expression, association, and belief. Right. So I don't want anyone to be unclear about that. I just think, again, we need guardrails even when it comes to thinking about that. Otherwise, we run the risk of collapsing legitimate rights with I would say, individual appetites, right? So just to clarify that. But yeah, so is the university liberal enough? I mean, like, yes and no, right? That's my example, because I mean, that's my response, because liberalism is said in so many different ways, and then there are just all these different pressures. I mean, it's just true. I mean, it's just undeniably true that conservatives are marginalized in the contemporary university, and the vast majority of the professorate who, you know, have this kind of personal animus against conservatives, like actually just don't ever interact with any conservatives, and it turns out they don't actually know what they believe or why they believe it. And I think that's been bad for the academy. I think it's been bad for our democracy. I mean, just one example, I could give so many, but like the current backlash from the new right with respect to our universities is obviously a product of this kind of lack of viewpoint diversity that we have. So like all of that is very real. The question is like, what do we do about it? And in this respect, I think we need to be more liberal, right? Like we need to be more tolerant of those with opposing ideas. I might have a slightly different understanding of why that's the case. It's not just like the mill style marketplace of ideas sort of argument. But I would just say that in the university, which is like, to my mind, the place where we engage in liberal learning, we want to be engaged in the art of dialectic. We want to be modeling and teaching and engaging in this art of dialectic. But if everybody kind of has the same position, it's hard to get a real dialectical exchange going. If like we root out everyone that doesn't share our priors, then of course the exchange is inevitably going to be less interesting, because that dialectical exchange, it's dialectical because there's this recognition that the opposing viewpoint is to some extent legitimate, right? Like there are arguments there, serious arguments that need to be engaged and addressed. Why? Well, because we're not actually going to understand our own position unless we enter into that kind of dialectical exchange. And I think, but now when we get into that, I think maybe we need to be less liberal in the sense that in order for dialectical exchange to go well, you actually do need to cultivate certain habits of thinking and frankly, character. I mean, what do you need for dialectical exchange to even be possible, let alone go well? You need certain good habits. You need civility, right? You need to recognize your partner in dialectical exchange as someone with dignity and that has a place at the table. You need humility. You need a kind of docility and openness to learning from other people who they don't have your priors. They don't have your personal experience. You need fortitude or perseverance. You need, studiositas as opposed to curiositas. Like I could go on, and for some liberals, like they freak out whenever you talk about formation. And I don't think that you should. I just think that's, those are the kinds of guardrails that I think actually are important for real liberal learning. So I guess for me, it's like yes and no.
Cornel, how would you respond to the question as well as to Jennifer?
You see, I just prefer the term Socratic or even jazz-like, which is lift every voice and cultivate the faculty of receptivity, to learn how to listen, to be humble, as Sister Jennifer says, to be humble enough. The hermeneutics of empathy and humility are even more important than the hermeneutics of suspicion, because we ought to be suspicious of hermeneutics of suspicion as well, even though there's great insights there of the Marx and Nietzsche's and Freud's and so on. But Socratic to me is much more crucial, because Socratic pits the kind of robust inquiry and conversation against any form of orthodoxy, narrow orthodoxy. Liberalism has its orthodoxy. conservatism has its orthodoxy. Christians like myself, we have our orthodoxy. I mean, we can read Chesterton. Of course, he Socratizes Christian orthodoxy. So it becomes something that is forever tied to self-criticism as you attempt to understand what it means to be human and so forth. The Confucius brothers and sisters, they have their orthodoxy. The Buddhists have their orthodoxy. Well, a university is a place where it's Socratic space, where all of these different perspectives are scrutinized, examined, interrogated in light of both context and text, with care, with a certain kind of respect and engagement and acknowledgement that all of us can change and grow. And we learn from each other. It's like a jazz jam session. You go in and you come out differently because you learn so much. You give it and you also receive. But you do have to cultivate various kinds of virtues of receptivity, of learning, of humility. Civility, that's not my language. That's too thin for me. It's a question of much thicker respect for one another in that way, you see. So there's a sense in which I would say I want university to be more Socratic, more jazz-like, rather than too liberal. Now, I believe that the progressive liberal orthodoxy is hegemonic in the university, but for me, that's not leftist. It's not leftist. To talk about race and class and gender is not to talk about predatory capitalist tendencies. It's not to talk about empire and imperial expansion of those tendencies and talk about ways in which it's connected to some of the worst things of our phenomenal war and what have you. So that there's a difference between a leftist or what you call a radical Marxist. Fred Jameson is not hegemonic in literary studies. It's Foucault. There's a big difference between Michel and Fred, you know. We want to be honest about that. But there's no doubt that when you get like my dear brother Robert George, as a conservative brother, that he's marginalized. There's no doubt that conservative brothers and sisters are marginalized in the universities where progressive liberal orthodoxy is hegemonic. And that's something that needs to be called into question. That's all.
Thank you. Joseph?
I share a lot of what Jennifer and Cornel just said. I think the question consists of three aspects. One is the prevalence of liberal and radical left ideologies within Western academia. And for that, I agree with the observations that there's indeed a dominance of the liberal left views on campus. And based on my limited experiences with universities in the US, primarily in Princeton, I think my observation is that faculty members in politics and philosophy departments in the US tend to predominantly align with liberal egalitarian values or views. I cannot ascertain the exact proportion of faculty that identifies themselves with the radical left, but there have been reports suggesting that students and university administrations have become increasingly intolerant towards faculty members or academic visitors who hold conservative views, views that are often deemed unacceptable by liberals, particularly those on the radical left. Well, as a moderate, I'm inclined to question any extreme or fundamentalist ideologies, whether they be liberal or conservative. I believe that liberalism should exercise caution and self-restraint in propagating its ideology within academia, both in Western and non-Western context. And it is my hope to see a greater diversity of ideological perspectives in the academia, including moral and political conservatives, Marxists, as well as non-Western perspectives such as Confucian, African, or Islamic viewpoints. But let me share a little bit of my personal experience working in the US and Hong Kong. During my several visits to Princeton, I had a pretty positive experience. Many faculty members and visiting fellows there were liberal egalitarians, no doubt about it, but they demonstrated an appreciation for non-Western perspectives. While these people may not necessarily agree with me coming from the East and having immersed myself in the Confucian tradition, but they were willing to engage me in constructive discussions inside seminars and over lunch. Of course, I have to do much harder than liberal egalitarians on campus because I sometimes critique their fundamental values, and I have to do so in ways that are rigorous enough to earn their respect and also interestingly enough to earn their attention. Now, move from my US experience back to Hong Kong. I'd like to share my observation in the following way. Before the protest in 2019, a large-scale social protest that broke out in the summer of 2019, before that, academics enjoyed significant freedom in teaching and research and in public expression with very little direct intervention from the government or from university administrations. The academic culture, in my view, was not dominated by any particular ideology. But however, following the Beijing and Hong Kong government crackdowns on the 2019 protest, and also following the introduction of the new national security law, which was imposed overnight on Hong Kong in July 1st, 2020, many vocal academics resigned and left Hong Kong. Undergrads are now required to take courses on the national security law, and faculty members are mindful that their classroom teachings and speech could potentially violate the law and be reported to the authorities by students. In addition, student unions have been disbanded, and campus events and activities have become apolitical. As a result, Hong Kong universities are facing increasing restrictions on academic freedom and are becoming less and less liberal, in a sense quite different from what you guys have talked about for American universities. So there's a contrast of why different universities in different places have become less liberal.
So, Joseph, to carry on with your some of your observations, we can transition into thinking about an additional critique that's been advanced about the prevalence of liberal thought or ideologies or political agendas in the university, and that comes from a more traditional philosophical sense. So the argument here would be something like the liberal intellectual foundations of the modern research university and its systems of thought. For example, the emphasis on individualism and disembedded rationality, the commitment to competitive commodification and private property, that these liberal principles leave the university ill-equipped to address many of the most pressing issues that confront us today, whether that's extreme economic inequality, anthropogenic climate change, the legacies of colonialism, the decline of civil society, the proliferation of diseases of despair, to name but a few. So this critical line of thinking would argue that, in fact, it was the underlying flaws of the liberal philosophical tradition that led to or exacerbated these problems in the first place. So a system of higher research and education that was so firmly rooted in this liberal tradition would perpetually struggle to address the root causes of our mounting social crises. So that's what we want to explore now. How would you respond to this more philosophically motivated critique of the relationship between liberalism and the modern university? Cornel.
That's a complicated question, my dear brother. I'm telling you, we need a whole 2-day seminar on that thing. I mean, one of the ironies of the emergence of the research university is that it was actually in Germany. And that's precisely a context where liberalism is thoroughly underdeveloped, to put it charitably. So when Johns Hopkins and Harvard appropriates the research university in the context of America, with its very fragile liberal democratic project, but also with its empire, and then with its ugly forms of white supremacy and male supremacy operating, it's going to take a good while for women and people of color to even gain access to these elite universities. But it's going to take a good while, going back to 1870s all the way up to the 1960s, right? That's a long time, especially the quickness and change in modernity in the States, that there is something to the charge that there are blind spots and very thick forms of ignorance and indifference built into some of the liberal discourses. There's just no doubt about that. It doesn't mean that the liberal discourses are to be dismissed. It just means that the best of those discourses are to be teased out and then see how it relates to these legacies of empire and white supremacy, male supremacy, and so forth, you see. Same would be true in its relation to commodification. I mean, one of the sad things, especially among our precious students, is the way in which secularism more and more is associated with hedonism and a narcissism, because the market tends to devour secularization. Whereas for me, the secular is very important in the face of the power of monarchs and queens and kings and protecting those rights and liberties, even if it's only of the liberties of the middle classes. But it's still, these are very important oppositional movements that need to be built on rather than dismissed. And so this issue of commodification of the university and the corporatization of the university, and instead of under Bismarck, it's tied to the state, where the universities were state servants. You end up more and more private market-driven universities with their big donors, and they become very much tied to the corporate elite and their wealth. And all you can do is just look at the buildings at universities these days, see all the big contemporary donors who remind you of the old robber barons of Vanderbilt and Hopkins and so forth and so on. And that's fine. They got a right, and thank God they're spending their money in a way that's trying to sustain education, but that has its constraints too. It makes it very difficult to have discussions about various issues. I mean, I've been wrestling with the issue of the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian situation, right? How do you have a Socratic discussion that stays in contact with the humanity of Jewish brothers and sisters and understands Jewish security, but also stays in contact with the humanity of Palestinian brothers and sisters concerned about Palestinian dignity? You can get in a whole lot of trouble, And it's tied to not just the university, but it's tied to the background conditions of the various donors that are giving, and not just Jewish donors, there's a whole lot of non-Jewish donors who are also deeply committed to various conservative conceptions of the state of Israel. And they have a right. For me, their voices are very important, but let's get into public space. Let's have our arguments. Let's have our analysis. Let's have our visions, and let's engage it. And that's just one small example among others, but a very important one these days.
Joseph, so how would you respond to this more philosophically driven critique of the prevalence of liberal ideologies and the formation and orientation of modern universities?
Benjamin, you mentioned the problems of individualism and this embodied or this embedded rationality, commitment to competitive commodification, private property, blah, 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 being problems of the liberal ideology. And these are the reasons for making the modern university ill-equipped to address many pressing issues like economic inequality and climate change, colonialism. Well, I'm not sure if I would completely agree with this diagnosis. I mean, I can only speak from my own personal experience, first in Princeton and secondly in Hong Kong. I've been visitors to the Princeton Center for Human Values, which is an interdisciplinary center devoted to the study of many pressing issues of the day. Faculty and visiting fellows there are genuinely invested, I think, in addressing crucial societal concerns such as economic inequality, climate change and colonialism. I've attended many workshops and seminars addressing these issues. And the people there are also receptive to diverse ideological perspectives. And I don't think any one of them actually will be espousing notions of detached individualism or exclusive rationality, often associated with a very kind of outdated form of philosophical liberalism. And I think a lot of their scholarly work there at Princeton reflect a nuanced understanding of the intricate interplay between social and political dynamics, demonstrating sensitivity to the complexity of the real world. But as far as the University of Hong Kong is concerned, they have established for 10 years now a strong common core curriculum, which requires every undergrad students to take. And a lot of courses are devoted to the study of climate change, the problem of globalization, and the problems of capitalism, and so on and so forth. So I don't think one can speak of the university as such being ill-equipped. Individual teachers and individual curriculums have put in a lot of effort in helping students to understand those things. But I also should add that a university is almost by nature a pretty conservative institution. I mean, a university is not there to, do revolutionary work, to promote a very strong-handed approach to stir up students' interest in reforming society. I mean, a university needs to get resources from the government. It's accountable to a lot of various stakeholders in society. So I would not fault modern universities for, erring, if at all, on the side of being a bit more conservative when it comes to looking at the responsibilities to change the world.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I mean, this question is so interesting, and there's so much there, and you could take it in so many directions. I mean, I guess I would just say, I'll just put my cards on the table and say that I think that universities, at least at the level of undergraduate education, right, should be devoted to something like the pursuit of wisdom for its own sake, right? So it's not, right, it's there for that. It's to meet that human need, precisely because it's higher education, right? And it's the sort of education that makes a human being free in an internal sense, free to explore and to try to understand those questions that lie at the heart of human existence, and try to figure out through higher study, sort of like, how you might contribute to the common good, sure, but also like, what's the point or purpose of your life? What sort of thing are you, to help you gain a kind of self-knowledge and to develop those habits of critical self-reflection that would give you even a half-decent chance, right, of having a modicum of self-knowledge in your life. And so it's really an education for human flourishing. It's not an education for a life of work. And I think that something that's happened in, since the 50s, really, is that in what I would call the neoliberal university, which is the university kind of running itself like a business and seeing students as customers and being a very weird kind of nonprofit that's very concerned with profit, it's just totally lost its understanding of its true mission, which of course is not to make money, but to educate the next generation of citizens, and to educate them in a truly higher way. So I'm not so much worried that liberalism has made undergrads like unable to solve climate change. I think that that sort of specialization comes after you have that fundamental base of liberal learning, which has been totally marginalized and neglected and watered down in our universities. And the other point that I want to make is I think we forget, like when we just start talking about the university, is that the university is like a really big thing, right? My university includes the undergraduate core. It also includes the med school, the law school, right? Like all of the graduate education, the School of Public Health, the journalism school. I mean, it also includes, right, the board of trustees and things like this. And so I think that we need to just not lose sight of that. And of course, there are all kinds of ways that you can specialize and be concerned, like not with study for its own sake, but like changing the world. There's all sorts of space for that in the university, right? We have not lost that at all, so far as I can tell. What we have lost and what I'm really fighting for is our sense of like, our fundamental mission being that undergraduate liberal education, and everything else branches out from that. And so for me, like the interesting critiques of liberalism come from people like Pat Deneen, who wrote this book, Why Liberalism Failed. He has this whole chapter on what's happened to liberal learning. And while Deneen and I really disagree about how to fix the problems, like his critique, I think really needs to be taken seriously. So that's kind of my response.
Thanks, Jennifer. I want to move to the next question, but Cornel, I saw you moving your head several points during that discussion. So I'm wondering if you want to respond to anything or add anything to this discussion.
Well, I mean, I'm just resonating with my dear sister Jennifer and brother Joseph, but I do want to say that I think it's true that universities are always in some ways conservative. It's just like churches, mosques, and synagogues. They tend to accommodate themselves to the status quo in order to perpetuate their own institutional status. But prophetic critiques always have to be raised because, I mean, for example, when Charles Beard gets pushed out of Columbia in the 19-teens because he's against the war, in Columbia University has completely accommodated itself to the war. Well, you see, that is a conservative institution in the bad sense. Now, the conservative in the best sense is preserving the best of the past, but it's in the bad sense because it's not allowing for Socratic dialogue. He's got to go to the new school. Or when Paul Sweezy's pushed out of the economics department, Joseph Schumpeter's fighting for him. I mean, he's not a Marxist, Paul Sweezy is, but he's pushed out because of the anti-communist hysteria, right? So that's universities in the conservative bad sense. They're not committed to robust Socratic conversation. And so I just want to accent that in some way. And I would say the same thing with Sister Jennifer in terms of, it's one thing to recognize that the university in no way is there to indoctrinate and politicize. It's Socratic across the board. But when you have universities that become dependent in some ways on fossil fuel companies that are given big monies and make it difficult for the critiques of those companies to be at the center of a conversation because of the money flow, that's not Socratic. And that needs to be called into question. And that's, again, no matter what the ideology is, it could be leftist, liberal, right-wing, Christian, Buddhist, whatever it is, it's got to be called into question. I know Notre Dame's a complicated place because you've got all of this rich Catholic tradition, but they've got to be Socratic too. And Alistair McIntyre, with all of his greatness, would be the first one to acknowledge. You know his book on God at universities and trying to understand the history of from Padua to John Henry Newman in the 1850s. Very important insights, part of the conversation. But in the end, for me, it's got to be Socratic. And that's always something that the university will fall short of. But at least we ought to be mindful of what the standards are. So that was part of my head nodding, though, Sister Shahrzad.
Thank you. You all agree that one of the purposes of a university should be to cultivate intellectual, civic, and moral or spiritual values. And furthermore, that the patterns of free inquiry and open exchange that liberalism at its best envisions cannot flourish without the widespread influence of these virtues. But interestingly, some of the most prominent expressions of liberalism, Rawlsian liberalism most notably, assume that the ideals of the good held by various peoples are inherently incompatible. In other words, this liberal line of thinking sees the perfectionist pursuit of virtues as illiberal, precisely because perfectionism makes claims about what is good and what is virtuous and about what habits are needed to cultivate the good life. But when we actually look at what the world's great religious and ethical traditions consider the good life to be, we find that their differences are often less radical than these liberal perspectives assume. In other words, and to put it in Rawlsian terms, there's often a striking degree of overlapping consensus. So I want to ask you, well, first of all, do you agree with this reading of our spiritual and ethical traditions? If so, what do you see as some of the common values that consistently recur within this broader spiritual heritage of humankind? And what might it look like for a university to maintain a perfectionist orientation toward these common ideals while still exhibiting a genuine openness to the many varieties of human thought and human experience? Joseph, let's start with you this time.
Yes, it's a very important questions. My work in the last 2 or 3 decades have been, an attempt to defend perfectionism in the age of modern pluralistic society against the kind of Rawlsian liberalism that you just mentioned. And I'm not saying that we should, join with others in promoting only one comprehensive doctrine, one brand of ideological vision of the world. And with that would be, unacceptable, especially given the modern liberal pluralistic conditions. But I've been trying to say that, there are actually specific individual values and virtues that seems to be pretty uncontroversial, as you just suggested, that they have been part of, the essential constituents of many different religious and philosophical traditions. I try to, pin down these sort of set of so-called common values into two groups. First group is those values, the experience of which would enhance our lives, make our lives go better. And the second group of values would be those things that would help us cultivate our character and make us better persons. So better lives and better persons. For the former group, I think those common values that makes our lives go better are such as, experiences of love, friendship, care for others, appreciation of nature and the arts, spiritual awareness of some kind, joy of understanding, the excitement of creativity. And for the other group that, makes ourselves as better humans or better persons, I consider virtues like shared moral and intellectual virtues. For moral virtues such as justice, fairness, benevolence, courage, toleration, and for intellectual virtues, for example, open-mindedness, fair-mindedness, and humility, very much like what Jennifer have just said, a few times already. And by the way, my PhD thesis was on Aristotle. And then afterward, I moved to Confucianism. Both Aristotelianism and Confucianism shared a strong perfectionist perspective on the human life and society and politics. But they need to be adapted and revised in light of modern conditions, no doubt about it. But if we completely forego this perfectionist perspective, and if this perfectionist perspective on life was to disappear in modern civilization, it will be a catastrophic sort of a consequence. And so I hope that the modern university would help students to learn about these values and to have the opportunities to acquire those moral and intellectual virtues while they are still in their formative times.
Jennifer?
Well, once again, I mean, yeah, I basically agree. So maybe I'll just say more, just kind of building on what Joseph just said. I mean, so my whole academic career, research-wise, has mostly been devoted to virtue, right? Virtue ethics, virtue theory, and so included in that are, some account of human nature and human flourishing. The concept of virtue, like, kind of gets a grip there. And I've been really lucky in that I, early on in my career, won grants that allowed me to do interdisciplinary, like really serious interdisciplinary work, where I worked really closely with social scientists and thinking about virtue and trying to see how virtue plays out from their perspective, which is more empirical and quantitative than mine. And then also, as part of those interdisciplinary projects, I was able to work with people from other traditions, people from Eastern traditions, people from different aspects of the Christian tradition, and then also scholars from within the Islamic tradition. And something that, so you have like, Confucian strands of it, but also like Buddhist strands, and then also strands within Indian philosophy. We kind of had everyone involved. And one thing that I can tell you after 3.5 years of doing that, and then continuing to do it once the grant ended, is that you pretty much can't find a tradition that doesn't have some accounts of what in the Western tradition we would call the cardinal virtues, right? So there'll be a volume coming out this year from Oxford University Press that I edited on practical wisdom. And we're looking at practical wisdom as it's conceptualized in all these different traditions. And not surprising to me at this point, very, very similar. And so I think that this idea of liberal neutrality as necessarily tied to individual autonomy is oversold. That actually any conception of autonomy that's actually going to be connected to human flourishing is going to have to respect actual human nature. And you can see this across traditions, but then you can also see it in empirical research. And so I think we need to, good old fashioned liberals or Rawlsians need to take that reality much more seriously than they have managed at this point, because that simply is the reality. But I would also say that, in terms of the university being more perfectionist, to me, it's like really simple. Cornel talks about the university being Socratic. I talk about it being dialectical, but they're actually the same thing, right? Socrates is like the great example of dialectical inquiry. And again, if we're talking about liberal learning and freedom, you don't just get that, right? You actually do have to cultivate certain habits in teachers and in students for that Socratic exchange or that jazz-like thing to happen. If you just put a bunch of people down in a room with instruments and say, play some jazz, it's going to be terrible because they need to have a certain training to do that, right? Jazz is all about improvisation, but it takes training.
That's right.
It's the same thing for Socratic exchange. You just don't get it for free. And I just think we need to get real about that.
Thank you. Really interesting.
Absolutely.
Cornel, how would you respond to the, what are your thoughts on the cardinal virtues?
It's a wonderful, wonderful question because, John Rawls is such a towering figure, even when he's wrong. And that's very important to note because, I remember the day sitting in his house with his wife, Anne, with the picture of Abe Lincoln on the wall, with all the text on Abe Lincoln, and then the text on the English Civil War, then the text on the 8 civil wars in France between the Huguenots and the Catholics. And he comes out of World War II, where he lost his faith. He wanted to be an Episcopal priest coming out of Princeton, as Brother Joseph knows, and becomes then a secular content political philosopher. So if we spend a little time in his skin, we can see that perfectionistic talk for him and thick conceptions of the good lead toward what Montaigne was wrestling with in the 16th century, all of these civil wars. It leads toward the English Civil War with the Levelers and Company. It leads toward World War II with fascism. Now, he has a thin theory of the good, we know, and the crucial one is the basis of self-respect. So he's holding on to some semblance of what the religious traditions had talked about, because none of these secular liberals can get by without some of the capital from the religious tradition. Now, we know that. Secularism doesn't just appear from the sky. It's always dependent, creatively appropriating earlier religious traditions. Kant's kingdom of ends looks a whole lot like the kingdom of God or beloved community, and treating people as ends rather than means. So our secular brothers and sisters, they know the degree to which they are in part building on earlier religious tradition. But our challenge is, any of us who want to talk perfectionistic talk, how do we meet the Rawlsian challenge of dealing with conflict leading toward overwhelming strife, war, massive massacres, ... And that's true for Aristotelians, it's true for Alistair McIntyre, it's true for Jennifer, it's true for Joseph, it's true for Benjamin, it's true for our dear sister Sabet yourself. We all have to be able to meet that Rawlsian challenge, even if we're critical of his conception of the right being prior and the thin theory and public reason being so evacuated of any substantive religious conceptions of the world. I think he's wrong about that, but if we understand what motivates him, then I think we actually begin to allow for much more, more the kind of serious discussion that we've had here that's worked in the scholarship of those on this screen.
So this series is called Reimagining the University. So in that spirit of reimagination, we wanted to close by inviting you to consider what the modern research university could be. I know this is something we've spoken about already, but hopefully we can go a bit further. So as valuable as it is to critique the university, we're also interested in the constructive transformation of universities into institutions of knowledge generation that genuinely serve the interests and needs of humanity. So we'd like to go further in asking you to articulate a positive vision of the university, of a future university, of a possible university. What kinds of knowledge would this reimagined university produce? What kinds of methodologies would it employ? What kinds of person would its educational processes give rise to? What would its relation be to the immediate community in which it is situated and to the land on which it sits? And what would be its relationship to humanity as a whole? So obviously these are big questions. We don't expect a final, comprehensive answer in a few minutes, but paint us a picture, if you would, of what a reimagined university could be. So Cornel, we'll start with you.
Oh my God, no, I was hoping you'd start with the other two, because that's a hell of a query, though, brother. Good God Almighty. I mean, what do I mean by Socratizing the university? What are the various dimensions and elements that go along with that? And that means you got to create a whole culture of that tries to cultivate certain kinds of virtues, certain kinds of ways of looking at the world that allow for a ability to take seriously viewpoints that radically disagree with one's own. See, that doesn't just happen in and of itself. It's got to be cultivated. It's got to be exemplified by some of the figures that people ascribe a lot of gravitas to, but also the role of money. I mean, I wish that we could preserve the high quality of universities and decommodify it and make it available to people without having to pay $80,000 among these elite universities and $60,000 and $50,000 and become so money driven that the golden calf too often becomes the center rather than the Socratic energy that ought to be at the core of any university. And we have to acknowledge now, most of our students these days are STEM students. I mean, that's crucial. There's a sense in which humanities have been so marginalized and pushed to the peripheral that we've got to be able to connect with our STEM students and give them a sense of the Socratic spirit, give them a sense of what's at stake in wrestling with the issues of life and death and joy and sorrow and disappointment and disillusionment as they engage in science. And there, science is not really tied to the quest for wisdom at all. It's not part and parcel of their project. They're trying to engage in high level explanation, given the mathematization of knowledge and given the role of quantitative analysis rather than qualitative analysis. And that's fine, that's beautiful, that's crucial. STEM is very important parts of knowledge quest, but that's different than wisdom. And I think Jennifer would agree in terms of difference between quantitative knowledge and qualitative wisdom in that regard. But that's just a very inadequate stab at your question, though, I'm telling you.
Well, Joseph, we'll pose the unfair question to you next.
Well, it's a very difficult question to envisage in a positive way, a vision of the university. I think in a university setting, in my sort of conception, undergraduate education should prioritize learning and exploration over professional training, like in business or medicine or engineering. These studies should be best addressed at the graduate school level. And here I think I'm in perfect agreement with Jennifer and Cornel too. So I want to see a well-rounded curriculum for undergrads, featuring a common core, which is crucial to exposing students to the breadth and the depth of human experience and thought. The common core curriculums should introduce students to these diverse traditions of thought that embody those common human values and virtues. And this curriculum should allow students to explore and appreciate the richness of human wisdom. Now, of course, the specific design of the core curriculum can vary from university to university. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, in Jennifer's case, she's helping to build a big books approach. And in the University of Hong Kong, the common core curriculum takes the model of an education that encourages students to explore 4 areas of inquiry. The first is science, technology, and big data. Second is art and humanities. Third is global issues, and the fourth is China. This approach ensures that students are exposed to a diverse range of topics and perspectives, promoting intellectual curiosity and understanding of the human life and society. Well, in order to foster a rich and intellectually stimulating academic environment for students to learn, I think it's essential that both faculty and students to be granted maximal freedom of thought and expression in their research and teaching and learning. And also, I hope that there should be ideally a well-equipped physical campus, which can facilitate the fullest possible student experience on campus and promote a vibrant campus life. I think in addition to a robust academic atmosphere, my ideal of a university is that the campus should be a place where students and faculty alike should feel free to cultivate a culture of openness and collaboration. And this should include ample opportunities for informal interactions outside of the classroom setting, including opportunities for mentoring and mentorship. Cornel mentioned several times the Socratic approach to university education. I completely agree with, or the dialectical approach that Jennifer talked about. I think it is extremely important to student learning, but I'd like to add another approach, which I would call the Confucian approach. And the Confucian approach is an approach that emphasizes the importance of cultivating relationship with students outside of the classroom, educating them through honest conversations, and if opportunities arise, caring for their personal and intellectual growth. Now, as a teacher, you don't go around to see students and sit them down and talk to them. No, mostly it's some of the students from your class anyway will appear to you and come to your office and ask you for advice and opinions about not just their academic studies, but their personal lives, their personal problems. And those are the opportunities that present to us as faculty, as teachers, to relate to them in more personal ways outside of the classroom. And Confucius is regarded as the most important teacher in China, precisely because he engaged in intense relationships and interaction with his students. So education by edification, and not just by Socratic cross-examination inside a classroom. In my own teaching career in the last 30 or some years, I've tried to combine both the Socratic method inside the classroom and the Confucian method outside of the classroom. That would be my idea of undergrad education.
Thank you so much, Joseph. So Jennifer, we'll give the last word to you.
Once again, I find myself agreeing with my co-panelists. So sorry if you were looking for a bunch of fireworks and disagreeing. Definitely not getting it. I'm just so gratified to hear you talk about the importance of mentorship and advising, because I think that it's critical. I mean, we focus so much on the classroom and the curriculum, and that makes sense. We shouldn't not focus on that. But sometimes we forget that, well, actually, I think we just have forgotten that the university is supposed to be a community, right? And a community is a group of individuals who are a community insofar as they're working for a common good, right? And otherwise, there's just no communal activity there. You're just a bunch of people together doing your own thing under the same banner. And I am in this like incredibly privileged position that I am currently right now building an institution in higher education. I've been tasked with building an honors college. And I take very seriously the idea of a college, the idea of a collegium, right, as a living, learning community. And the motto of the college, right, is Sapientia Virtus Amicitiae, wisdom, virtue, friendship, right? And friendship is actually like very critical to this because, right, we can't actually search for wisdom as a common good without virtue, without the virtues that I've talked about. But like, what's the space where virtue is exercised and cultivated? It's in friendships, right? And I think we've really lost that, this idea of it being a community where we're trying to help. I mean, universities have become spaces of just total competition, right? Where, and it's reflected in the discourse, where the discourse is not dialectic at all. It's not Socratic. It's all about dominating and winning. And that's why you have young people being like, we need more debate. And I'm like, look, debate's fine, but actually debate's just about winning. What I want is dialectic, right? What I want is something much deeper and much more rewarding that actually is opposed to domination, right? It's not just about winning or beating or dominating your opponent. It's about really listening to them and taking what they're saying seriously and trying to figure it out together, right? Because there's also this notion that like, you're not going to figure it out on your own, actually. You do need some help there. And so actually after this Zoom call, I'm going to be interviewing. I have a dean job that is just dedicated to mentorship and advising, because it's just going to be such an important part of this college, because so much of this formation is obviously going to take place outside of the classroom. And so I'm just really gratified to hear you say that, and also to say that it's Confucian. That's great. I love it. I also think it's Aristotelian, but it just shows like how much resonance that there is between these two seemingly opposed traditions. So I would just say, just speaking as someone who is building an institution, one of the things that I'm really trying to resist is this idea that the gold standard of knowledge in a university is expertise. I mean, that's what it's become. Some people are very explicit about it, but just implicitly, if you look at the actual structures and incentives of the modern research university, what does it spit out? It spits out narrow, specialized expertise. And I don't think that's the gold standard of knowledge. I want to return back to Newman's idea of universal knowledge, right? Where we're trying to understand as best as we can from within our own limited disciplinary perspective, this ultimate horizon of truth. We want to have a system that allows people to look outside their disciplinary silo and be like, okay, this is what I think about virtue, but what are the economists saying? What are the psychologists saying? And it turns out they are saying things about it. But the way that the modern research university is constructed, you're like not even allowed to look. like you're not incentivized to look, you're not rewarded for looking. We've made it really hard. So I want to return to this idea that the gold standard of knowledge is actually universal knowledge. And if we took that as the gold standard, as the ideal, right, we would be looking at things more holistically. We would be incentivizing a substantive core curriculum that was centered around producing that kind of knowledge. And then in terms of the specialized tracks, which are important and good, and I'm not denying that, but we would recognize the value of interdisciplinary research, and we would encourage that, and we would incentivize it, both at the level of like research outputs, but also in our teaching. We hardly ever do interdisciplinary teaching. That's a mistake, in my opinion. So I would in the future, in terms of reforming the university, I would like us to consider a model of knowledge beyond expertise. Expertise is good. We shouldn't give up on that. But why do we suppose it's the highest kind of knowledge? I don't think that it is, actually.
I know Ben said that was the last word, but we have about 2 minutes left. And I don't want to waste it. So I'm going to give each of you about a minute to share any closing thoughts or to raise any points that you think that we missed in this conversation. Cornel, why don't you go first?
Well, I mean, I'm glad that Sister Jennifer again invoked John Henry Newman, because he talks about an integrated conception of universal knowledge. That reminds me of Whitehead's Great Adventures of Ideas, which is required reading for every member of Society of Fellows, going all the way back to Harvard's 1920s with Harry Levin and others. Now, why is that important? It requires a synthetic vision. Lukács, Marx's totality, interrelations, how the parts depend on parts, how is the whole more than just the sum of the parts. Specialized knowledge and the disciplinary division of disciplines these days curtails integrated, totalizing, synthetic visions, synecdochic imaginations, and synthetic analysis. And that's what people are hungry for in a moment of overwhelming catastrophes. You have to be able to see these interdependencies. And so I definitely agree, but I just want to connect Newman with Whitehead and even Lukács's sense of how commodification shatters any totalizing orientations across the board. You don't have to be a Marxist to be able to see how crucial that insight actually is. And how do we get back to that? That's the tough, without being nostalgic. You can't go back, as we know. But I just don't want to say too, this has been a wonderful conversation for me, and I just deeply appreciate both of you all facilitating this as leaders and then having the wonderful panelists to learn from.
Thank you so much. Joseph?
I'm aware of the time. I just want to say how much I enjoyed these conversations, and I found a lot of things that I agree with and wholeheartedly endorsing of what Jennifer and Cornel have said. One last point about virtue. Jennifer mentioned this word many times, and I also agree this is a very important topic. Cornel hasn't mentioned it as often as Jennifer, the virtue, and I want to know why. But my experience in the U.S. is liberals seldom use this word. They don't talk about virtue. Whenever the word comes out, they associate with Christianity, and they think this is sectarian and not broad enough. So for those who want to promote the study of virtue, we have to find a way of, modernizing it, making it more fashionable and attractive to modern sensibility, maybe.
Jennifer, any closing thoughts?
Well, just to pick up on that, I always used to joke that whenever I wanted to make a point that Aquinas made, I would just say Aristotle so anyone would listen to me. I mean, I feel that that deeply resonates with me. This idea that, oh, it's like virtue, that's Christian. And it's like, have you read any pagan philosophy? Like literally any of it? Because it's all there. And last time I checked, they're really not Christian. So, but I actually don't want the last word. I want to know why Cornel not on the virtue train.
Oh, no. I'm maybe in the caboose, because the profound insights of virtue thinking from Aristotle to Alistair, but I mean, in my own tradition as Christianity, what is faith and hope and love all about? Now, virtue is too abstract. You got to concretize and fleshify what faith means, what hope means, what love means. But I'm very much deeply tied to virtue train. It's just that when you're on the caboose, it means you're also able to see some of the blindnesses of virtue discourse, as well as I'm on a liberal caboose train, but I see deep, blind spots of liberalism. But I'm on a whole host of leftist trains, but I can see various blind spots of Marxism and feminism and critical race theory and so forth. None of these theories in the end are able to fully explain the complexity of who we are and what the world is. And no theory is kind to us that cheats us of seeing, as Henry James told Robert Louis Stevenson. And once we have that sense of humility, every theory has its blind spots. Then the question becomes, how are we improvisational in terms of these various traditions? So in that sense, I mean, Confucius tradition, all of its variety and heterogeneity is indispensable in terms of relations and so forth and so on. But then we got to go back, but there's hierarchy in Confucius that we need to be highly suspicious of. Here come our modern sensibilities. That's fine. We're not dismissing Confucius and all of that rich tradition, but we've got some other things on that Confucius train. Is that fair, Brother Joseph?
Yes. That's why I've spent years in trying to modernize Confucianism and integrating it with liberal democratic values that I've found agreeable.
Absolutely. No, indeed. No, you've done a marvelous job too.
Well, I am very sorry we have to stop, but I hope we can continue the conversation before too long. Jennifer Frey, Joseph Chan, Cornel West, what a thoughtful, rich, and just wonderfully stimulating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks for hosting this.
And we thank both of you. You all were wonderful.
Yes, thank you.
So many thanks also to our sponsors, the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University, and the Center on Modernity in Transition. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us today. We hope that you'll join us again next time on Friday, May 19th at 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific, when we will welcome Christopher Olds, Deandra Rose, and Caitlin Zaloom to discuss the university and economic forces. And note that recordings of past events in this series and other series can be viewed on COMIT's YouTube page. See you all next month. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.